podcast for those who suffer, which is everyone.
It's a space where we can speak honestly about what it feels like to be in desolate places without losing hope.
Welcome to In the Thicket.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to In the Thicket. This week we're talking about obedience. So, what context, you might ask? Well, we're talking a lot about obedience in the church in terms of obedience to legitimate authority and when that really hurts, what it means to be obedient, what it means to listen to the Lord's will, what it means to have an informed conscience, what it means to follow the Lord and to trust Him, that His overall plan will bring about His will, even if it's not in the short term. All of these things and more are part of the conversation, and we hope that it's helpful for you. God bless.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Rachel. Hey, Erin. How's it going?
Hello. Good.
I'm Nicole. I'm the one hosting today. We kind of take turns on the different topics hosting.
We do, just in case you're listening. I'm Erin.
Yeah, I'm Rachel. I guess, Nicole was like, hey guys, this is something where if you guys are new to the podcast, if anybody's new, so that's who we are. And we just repeated it 2 times. So now you hopefully really know our names. That's all you know if you just joined us.
That's okay. Well, see you later. See you next week, everybody.
How are you? So now I feel like we're well into winter now. I've been feeling, so in Nashville, we had yes, I am going to talk about the weather as
excellent.
Yeah. And we just had a little ice storm this week. And so legitimately everything was covered in ice. And today it melted and it was really cool because the sky was clear, but you could just hear dripping water everywhere because all the trees were dropping water and the ice and everything.
Nice.
But it feels very gross and wintry. It's starting to get into that kind of all right, we're ready for some warmer weather. How are you guys?
Well,
doldrums or no?
Just a lot of snow here. I mean, Rachel would understand because she drove from DC yesterday.
Yep.
From DC to Hamilton. So how long of a drive was that, Rach?
So it's 8 hours, 8 hours and 20 minutes kind of in the car, but then stops, which I really kind of minimize my stops, but gas and bathroom breaks. So it ends up being about maybe 9 hours. I would say a generous take would be 10 hours.
Right.
I border crossing too.
But then I left at 4:30 in the evening and I drove through the night, which, take it or leave it, might be kind of sketchy to do that, but it's great because border crossing is absolutely a cinch.
True.
There's literally no one there. If you try to cross the Canadian border from the US at 1 a.m. on a Wednesday night, usually you're good.
No one else is wanting to
go.
No
one's into it. Yeah.
At that point. That's great.
Yeah. That's good. I love driving long distances like that too. Honestly, I drove, when we drove to Nicole's wedding, I drove for the most part, almost all of it. And that was from Toronto to Thunder Bay and then Thunder Bay to Winnipeg. But one time I drove by myself from Winnipeg to Sault Ste. Marie. Yep. And then back up from there. But
so long.
Yeah.
It's wild. And that route is so wild in the sense that you are in the wilderness for so much of it.
It's
north of Superior. Yeah. So you can actually go 8 hours in 8 hours because there's just no one else on the road. There's not traffic in the same way as many other places.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Anyway, okay, listen, we're getting back to the snow topic just for 2 seconds because I saw a great picture on Facebook today. It was from a neighbor. I don't know. It was in the Buy Nothing group. You know how they have those on
Love
Facebook?
Buy Nothing.
Love Buy Nothing. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a great way to get rid of all your junk that somebody else might love and also to take in other people's junk, which is just great, so I'm a big fan.
I got this couch from Buy Nothing.
Ooh.
I have this couch that I'm showing. It's it was in a therapist's office.
Oh,
wow. Got rid of it when I moved to Nashville and didn't have any furniture. So it was great.
Sweet. Yeah, that's great. See, it's a good thing. So this one, I don't even know. It was the funniest post because it wasn't asking for anything or saying anything. All she put up was a picture and a sad face as her caption. And it was a picture of, then she explained it in a comment underneath when somebody asked what the heck it was. So it was basically a picture of this wall of snow that was at least 5.5 feet. And on the other side was the road. And on the side where she was taking the picture was the sidewalk. So it was like probably like 5.5 feet high and probably like a foot wide. And it was the end of her driveway. And it was like, yeah, it was like formed because the plows went by and then the sidewalk shovelers went by. And so then she just had like a 5.5 foot wall of snow.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's good that I guess she had sidewalk shovelers or whatever, because then because like it sounds like they got a lot of snow, like a crap ton of snow.
Oh,
she didn't have to manually kind of go through that.
It's insane the amount of snow that we've had. We haven't had a super cold winter yet. It's gonna get cold today and tomorrow, but like the amount of snow has been like 20 centimeters at a time, 30 centimeters at a time. It's a lot of snow. For Americans, I don't know what that is in inches. I'm sorry.
I know.
I can't tell you.
20 centimeters is like 2.5, right? So
sure.
It's like a solid 8 inches there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So something like that, whatever
Well,
it is. Like
the
a foot
other
of
thing
snow.
So it's been like kind of cold in Nashville. And also in Texas, they've gotten they had like kind of a freeze and like a bunch of folks. My parents are there and they were trying to come to Canada and their flights were grounded 2 days and the rest of their flights got canceled. They're supposed to be here yesterday and they weren't able to. They were supposed to leave today and they weren't able to. So just like crossing
right. So I mean, basically all of this talk about weather, just to make an announcement to all of our listeners, we're all moving to Florida. Everybody's moving to Florida all together. We're gonna not even Texas, because Texas gets cold.
Apparently they get
Florida. Snow. No, we're just going to Florida.
We're going there.
This is the interesting thing, though. Okay, I learned this since moving to the U.S. What the reputation that Florida has in Canada is basically it's warm there, and all of the seniors go there. That's basically it, right? That's what we know about Florida. And then I moved here, and everyone's like, "Ugh, Florida," And I was like, "What's wrong with Florida? I thought it was super nice down there." Anyways, it's much more complex.
Okay. So, because like culture, like Florida, like it's like touristy, like that kind of thing.
Like I had to ask
all the Canadians are there. Is that
well, there's a bunch of Canadians. Yeah. I don't know. Well, I asked my husband because he's American. I was like, what is this about Florida? Why are people hating on Florida? But he's like, basically, I don't quite understand it still, but there's political reasons. So if people, don't tend to, maybe if people don't agree with the political leanings of Florida, then that can be a thing. It's also, I guess it has, a lot of people move there because it is warm and perhaps has a bit of a reputation of like party, kind of laid back something, or maybe not as like a little more wild, a little more criminal or something. I don't know.
All right,
listen, if there's any episode that we're gonna get hate mail,
I'm sorry. If there are some Floridians listening, please send me what's Florida actually like. I have never been there.
I've been there. I really like it. It's beautiful. I liked it too. I really loved it.
I mean, my grandma always used to bring us back shells. My grandparents were snowbirds. In Florida, and they kind of went every year basically until COVID.
Just in case you don't know what a snowbird is, that is a Canadian who spends the winter times in warm places in the US. Typically Florida.
Florida, sometimes Arizona, sometimes
maybe Texas, sometimes or New Orleans, or
just like south somewhere.
South, just where there's no snow. Yeah.
Right.
Good.
Yes.
All right. Listen, I'm excited for today's episode because I think this topic is fun.
Well, great. This is good. Well, yeah, if you tuned in, you're like, oh my gosh, what's this going to be about? So today we're going to talk about obedience, which is, okay, so this is a podcast on suffering. And when we think about obedience, at least from like a child's perspective of like, you must obey. It's like, it's one of the hard lessons that we have to learn as kids, right? Of like listening to our parents and stuff. And I feel like it never gets, I don't know if it ever gets easier, right?
No, yeah.
To curb our own wills. And so we started talking about this topic because without us trying to dive into the actual content of this situation or give any kind of opinion, because we don't feel like we know enough, the situation of Frank Pavone, who was formerly Father Frank Pavone, but who's been laicized, and the reason that was stated was that he was not obeying his bishop's instructions to stop being involved in political activities, which all priests are not supposed to do. They're supposed to, I think it's like encouraging people to vote, but not trying to guide people one way or the other in terms of which political parties and something like that. And so we were thinking about this, like, oh yeah, okay, so this is like a pretty severe punishment for someone because of obedience. So what does it mean to obey? What does it mean to obey? What is the place of obedience in our life as Christians, as Catholics, as humans, and what's, what are the sufferings that can come from that, and what are the joys that can come from that, and when is it appropriate to obey, when is it maybe not? Maybe I'll start with Erin, if you can give us maybe like the theological, like what does the church teach about obedience, and when are we supposed to obey and not obey, and who has, some people have special vows to obedience. How does that work?
Yeah, I think, feel free to interject, Rach and Nicole, as we go along. But I think, if we look at the church in general, we have a hierarchical structure. This is how Jesus set up the church, right? And he's given particular, like whatever roles people have, whether they're a bishop or they're like a religious superior for a religious congregation or something like that. Or whether they're our boss, and it's not even in a religious situation at all, or something like that. There is like a hierarchy of authority. And so we would say, it's reasonable to say that, okay, so the people who've been placed in legitimate positions of authority over us, when they're not asking us to sin, or to whom we owe a debt of obedience, so to our bishop or to a religious superior, or even to our boss, although of course that's a different context, or even like our spiritual director, in some ways, that we have an obligation to that obedience, but also that the church would say that the highest, like our conscience is the highest authority in our lives, right? So we always have a duty. It's not even just you should probably obey your conscience, but actually we have a duty to obey our conscience. However, that means having a well-formed conscience. So like it means that we have to know what the church teaches about obedience, for example. And if we have a well-formed conscience, then a well-formed conscience can help us to discern well when it's a situation of like, I should be obedient in this situation and suck it up, even though it's not the best thing. And I think this person's making a wrong decision. Or whether it's like, and we're never obliged to obey sin. Like if somebody's life wants to sin, like that's just, or if we're actually like, our conscience is asking us to voice some kind of conscientious objection to this person or whatever, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. It seems it feels muddy. It would be much easier. It would be much easier if it's just like, well, in the church, we're called to obey the church and obey our civil authorities and bosses, unless we're called to, it's leading us to sin, period, exclamation mark, the end, right? But then it's like, okay, we're also called to obey our conscience. And I wonder if sometimes discerning what is and isn't a sin, or like, is it a sin? In my mind, I'm like, okay, there's some obvious sins, right? Where it's like, if somebody tells you to go and steal something or kill someone, generally that's probably going to be a sin. And so don't do that thing, right? Even if it's coming from someone who's in authority of you. What if it's a sin of omission? What if it's something that somebody feels really called to do and feels convicted of, and then they're told, no, don't do this thing. And they're worried, yes, but I feel like God's calling me to do this thing. Now that's, right. So it can get tricky, but you're talking about, but then our consciences should be formed so that we have a sense of trust in the church and in the structure of the church, so that we obey even when it doesn't make sense to us. So I think I'm just repeating what you said, Erin, and just trying to
it's good though. But I have the humility. Go ahead.
I think that people sometimes, especially today, maybe because like there's a lot of stuff in our church today where, we've got like, there just is like a lot of areas of division and on this stuff often, on, are you called to obey your bishop in this or not this, or is your bishop in there? You know what I'm talking about? Like there's a lot of issues I feel like today where it's
your bishop wrong because he's doing away with the TLM? Is he like,
and again, like I'm not going to weigh one way or another on those things, but these are kinds of, that's a really good example of like different kinds of issues that are coming up. And I think
just for listeners who might not know, TLM stands for Traditional Latin Mass, which is people who go to a mass that's celebrated in the way that it would have been before the Second Vatican Council, where reforms were made and church mass was celebrated in the Roman, in the vernacular language.
Novus Ordo,
Novus Ordo,
but no. So that's a really great example, but I think there are other kinds of examples too. Like I can think of actually even in my diocese, like our, for example, there's a way, there's a norm for how you receive communion. Every sort of diocese has like, this is our norm, and you're allowed to. So this is not like a strict obedience thing, for example, but in our diocese, the norm that the bishop asks of us is to bow before receiving and not to kneel. So like preference for not kneeling. Now, I know a lot of really faithful Catholics who feel really called to kneel and do, and they're not being disobedient to the bishop in the sense that the bishop is not, like, priests are not allowed to refuse you communion in that context or anything like that. But like, it's one of these things where, so that when I work for the diocese, like as a pastoral worker or like campus minister or different kinds of things, I really had to make a decision, like, am I going to, because I had read that. If I hadn't read it, I don't think I would have worried about it, but I had read it and I was like, and it was in my mind. And I remember I made a decision to, because I used to like prefer kneeling, or not kneeling when I receive, but kneeling even before you receive, like you can sort of genuflect, right? And I used to do that, but I moved to bowing instead of genuflecting. And the reason I did that was because I realized when I would genuflect, like it would bring up in my mind, like, oh my gosh, like, oh gosh, the bishop says not to genuflect. What am I doing? And so then I wasn't really able to focus on the Eucharist. And so I was like, okay, you know what? I think, like, even though for me, it felt I was more compelled before I read this to genuflect, and that felt more sort of where my heart was, it was somehow still taking me away from like the Lord in that moment. And so I was like, okay, I will just do the bowing thing, even though I don't have, like, I think it's so like, it's very moving to me when people kneel and receive or genuflect before they, like, I just, that physical movement is a very beautiful symbol for me. So it's not like I was like, well, that's what everybody has to do. But I remember that was a struggle for me, and I resolved it in that way, because I think for me, the Lord was like, it's good. This is an exercise in humility. It's an exercise in obedience, because and it's good for you. So I was going to say, like, in these questions, I think like there's maybe lots of different ways you could land, but two sort of maybe main ways you could go is, one is sort of the pursuit of humility, and the other is maybe like the pursuit of righteousness. And like, really, you want both, but sometimes it can turn into like humility, like the flaws that can come from humility can turn into like, well, I'm not really asking myself the tough questions. I'm just sort of like, well, that's what I'm being asked to do, so I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to do it. And you're not even going to think about it at all. And the other side is like self-righteousness, where like, I thought about it and I'm right, so I'm just going to do it this way. Exactly. So I think like, you know, and I think for me, because I probably have a greater tendency to pride, I go towards humility as the way that I probably need to go. So unless like I know that there's some kind of sin involved, I think I've realized, like, probably more often than not, the Lord is calling me to be meek and sort of humble, even if I can still hold the position that I don't agree or don't love the order or the, you know, whatever I'm kind of deciding to obey in that moment. But I feel I have this kind of, over time, like the Lord is giving sort of this like deep, which not in a prideful way, but like just this deep kind of confidence that if I'm doing this act out of like just trust and humility that God is with me in that act, then even if I got it wrong in a certain sense, like if the bishop or the priest or whoever it is that I'm obeying, the Lord is with me, because like the intention there was not to be, you know, flippant, but it was to sort of avoid my primary tendency, which is toward pride, and to be obedient, because my desire is to obey the Lord in that moment. So I have less of fear of like getting the question right or wrong, as long as it's not sin, obviously, which can be a other thing. But
I want to ask you, Erin, too, if you've had situations where you've had to kind of obey, and I'll share some of my own too. But just as you're talking, Rachel, I want to reflect. There is something, in a sense, practical, where, and something, you know, the scripture in the Psalm, I think it's like, you know, I'm going to probably misquote this, but lean not on your own understanding, right? As Christians, as Catholics, we're not called to be right. We're called to be faithful. And faithfulness implies a faithfulness to, right? And sometimes that faithfulness to needs to take a human form, like the people who are given the task of leading, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember somebody talking about why was Moses not allowed to enter into the promised land when, you know, there was also sin by all the people and different things and you know, something like that. Why was he given such a severe punishment? And it was like, well, that he was the leader, so there was more weight on his responsibility to lead than the people's responsibility who were following him. And so I think there's something that holds true, where I don't have to figure out how the church should be run because it's too big for me. That's not my job. Right. But I have to do my best to love and follow and obey in the context that I find myself. Again, within the limits of conscience in severe matters. I think a really practical way that I've experienced this is when my husband and I were dating. We started dating about 3 months before COVID had happened. And at the time I was renting a room from some sisters in Toronto. So I was living in this convent. Two of the sisters were older. One was 98. She's turning 100 this year. Or she was 97 at the time, whatever. She was in her 90s, her late 90s. And, you know, the first kind of few days where the lockdown happened and everyone was talking about COVID, Nathan and I were still seeing each other in person, but we started talking about like, well, what, like, should we be, you know, everyone's starting this whole distancing thing and what should we do? Like, but we don't want to not see each other. We just started this relationship and, you know, and Nathan had a really difficult experience with like long distance relationship in the past. So he was like nervous about that. And it was just all these things. So we decided that I would go and talk to the Mother Superior of the house. And we would just say, look, this is, you know, we would like to see each other. What is your guidance? And whatever you say, we'll abide by that. And so we did. And she told us that she would appreciate us, you know, not seeing each other. Nathan was living with like 10 people at the time, with all these Ukrainian folks in another house. And then we had 7 people living in our place. So it just, you know, it made sense. So for 3 months, we were long distance, even though we lived a 15-minute walk apart, except for one time where we did end up hugging. So there was one time when, anyways, that was a whole situation, but where I had my mental health was rough that whole period. Anyways. Yeah. And so it was tough. It was really, really tough. But also I could see that there was some real graces that came out of that time, because we just ended up like FaceTiming a lot and talking and praying together over the phone. And not that we wouldn't have talked if we were in person, but it was just different because that was the only thing we could do. We couldn't go on dates. It was just conversations. It was beautiful. Yeah. And yeah, so there was grace in that. And then when it was time for, you know, when things ended a few months later, that first kind of lockdown, we're like, oh yeah, COVID's over. We were able to see each other again. So I don't know, but it was the same thing where it's like, I felt this weight of responsibility where I'm like, I don't want to get anyone sick in my house, and I don't want to get anyone sick in Nathan's house. And if that weight of responsibility is on someone who actually does have responsibility over the house and not on me, then it becomes not my job to figure out all of the risks and possible benefits and all the things, but just to trust in somebody who does have that authority, in whatever their decision was. Yeah. So it took, in a sense, it was hard, but it also took the weight off a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like, I love, I'm thinking even of even your example of the Eucharist, Rachel. Like I know for me, I firmly believe that, that receiving the Eucharist on the tongue should be the norm. I firmly believe that reverence for the Eucharist, that there are ways that we can restore that, right? Or that the postures that we use that reflect our inner posture are important for restoring like, these are things that I firmly believe. And I would argue, like, I have all kinds of good reasons for arguing about, you know, what happened with this dispensation and this document of the church says this, and I can 100% have that conversation with you until And I do believe those things very, very, very strongly. Yep. But also, I think there's something that to be said, because like we talk about suffering, we talk about offering it up and uniting our sufferings to the Lord, right? If you had a whole church who was on their knees offering up the pain of not being able to receive the Eucharist on their knees, and was offering that more than they were complaining, there are real graces that come from that I don't think we realize come from that of mortifying. It's not even mortifying ourselves. Like we talk about, you know, whatever, fasting or doing it's like these mortifications that the Lord sends, these opportunities for things. And it's not to say that we shouldn't communicate ourselves to our bishop or to a legitimate authority in love and charity, and make the movements of our heart known to those who have the ability to discern and to make those decisions in the competence of authority that they've been given. But also that we should do both. Like it should be a both and, you know, like those things in love and charity to those who are in positions of authority. And then also offering that pain of just eating it, like of I just said eating it in reference to the Eucharist, but
but also I think, like, you know, there's a way in which you obey that can be very powerful. Like, you know, like if I'm just going to use that same example, but like, so when I was like, okay, I'm going to choose to receive in this posture, but then this posture is the way that I'm receiving. I'm not doing sort of like fine, like begrudgingly, like, okay, like, it's like, well, now this is how I will receive. And so Lord, like, help me to prepare myself when I bow before you to receive you. And, you know, like, I think it's so funny. I mean, I'm not trying to say that this isn't like I'm the example of this, but I have experienced other people whose obedience in humility, when the witness is holiness, like when the witness in obedience is holiness, it is so powerful. Like it actually changes things. Like people become more open. People will like the discussion. I think we would be surprised how discussions can be moved forward. You know, that whole thing of like, I'm not trying to say like, don't talk, like lead by your life or like that kind of
not
like
saying that
focus St. Francis thing that, you know, which is, but there's something beautiful about it. I'm not trying to make fun of it entirely. Like there's a reason why people found that compelling. And I guess that's the thing that I'm picking out of that, which is that, you know, real holiness, not just like, don't be afraid to talk and lead just through your life example because you're afraid to talk. Not that, but at like holiness lived out is a conversation mover. Like people, it softens people and it opens their mind. It literally opens people's minds to other ideas and ways of being and thinking that they never would have ever considered before. Because it's just piercing to really experience the holiness of someone else, you know?
You know, and I wonder, there's a lot of talk about, you hear people saying, well, if only the priests or the bishops were leading in this way or doing this or saying this. And probably sometimes there's some truth to that. But I wonder if the strategy of complaining and arguing and debating and slandering is not as powerful as, you know, let's say, Erin, you were to write, you know, just communicate, just sticking.
I can give an example, like a real example of, because there was something that was happening at one of my previous workplaces, and it involved a decision that the bishop had to make about something. And so it was something that I felt very convicted about, you know, like, and I really still believe that the decision that we had landed at about the direction that we wanted to go was good and right and would be helpful and beautiful for the ministry and all of these kind of things, right? But ultimately it was the bishop's decision. And I ended up writing him a letter. This was before he made a decision. He never ended up making a decision. So there's no neat wrap up to the story, but I did end up writing him a letter when I knew he was considering all of these things. And in the letter, I basically just said to him, like, I recognize that you are the competent authority. I feel very strongly that this is the right thing to do, but I also feel very strongly about being obedient to you and to whatever you decide. And whatever you decide, I hands down I will be obedient to whatever you decide without protest, you know? And he sent me a message back and basically said, thank you for that. Like that it was very meaningful. And it was like, for me to send that, like, honestly, it was like eating shards of glass. That's what I said to the ladies before. Like, it felt like that. Cause I was like, I'm like typing the things out and I was like, this is true. And I want to be obedient. But at the same time, I'm like, with every keystroke of the thing, I was like, this is baloney. This is terrible. I shouldn't have to say this because I'm right. This is the best thing. And it was like this exercise in like forced humility. But I knew it was also the right thing to write him that and say, like, you are the bishop. You have the, you know, the final say.
You know, and I think what that does too, because what you're saying is, I'm entrusting this to you and I trust you. I trust you. And when you communicate to someone that you trust them, I think they experience the weight of that responsibility in a different way than when you say, well, I think you should do this. You're not entrusting the weight, that you're not saying that you trust them then with that responsibility. But when you're saying, I trust you, you're saying, I see that the responsibility is yours and I'm going to leave that with you. I'm not going to try to take that for myself. Right. I've experienced this even just with Nathan and I being, you know, making decisions together. And we really, I think, generally just make decisions together and we talk about things until we come on the same page. But once in a while, there'll be something where I'm like, you know what, I feel like maybe he just has a better idea of whatever it is. And I just say, okay, you know what, Nathan, like, I trust you, like, whatever you decide, I trust you. And he kind of like, he always, when I do that, he's like, oh, okay, well now that means like I have to make a really good decision because like you trust me with this, you know? And so I think there is something powerful of that. Like, and can we do that? You know, can we sort of make a self-fulfilling prophecy of trusting those who are in authority over us sometimes by communicating that trust?
I think there's even like one more level to that, which is, especially in the church, we're talking about obedience in the church, because there is sort of like, I trust the Lord. Like there's sort of like this sense of like, you know, which even in a way is like one up on that. Cause it's like, you know, I'm struggling with your decision and I don't know if I agree with you, but I don't have to, because I actually know who's running this show. Like in a certain sense, like there's a way in which I know that of the authority that underwrites your authority, which is the absolute authority. And I have so much trust in that authority that I'm not going to be perturbed by anything that you're doing, that in some cases even feels like you're going against that authority. But I don't have to correct you. I don't, because I know that I know who will. Like I know who will. One time and another, he will.
It comes down to the question of, do I trust that the Holy Spirit is leading the Catholic Church, or do I not?
Exactly.
And if I do trust that, then I can obey. I trust that even if I don't understand, it's not my job to understand, and I can obey, except in sin. But generally, it's going to be to obey, because I trust that the Holy Spirit is leading the Catholic Church. If we no longer trust that the Holy Spirit is leading the Catholic Church, then we're in the same camp as Protestants, right? Like,
and it doesn't mean that we don't do anything. That's the thing, right? Like,
no, I'm not trying to say that.
No, exactly, but sometimes I feel like that's the thing that we fall into, like, oh well, like, or the people, like, we can't fall into, because then if we say like, oh, I trust, Lord, that you're leading the church, and then it's like, okay, well, hands off, and we don't actually have to allow the Holy Spirit to speak through us or thing, right? But that's like
an act of trust.
But it is,
I will say, like, and you said this a little while ago in our conversation, Nicole, like, what am I called to do? Right. Cause like Nicole says, like, I'm not called to structure the church the, in quotes, right way. Like, that's not my vocation, you know? So like, I think that can be really distracting too. And you're like, well, I'm supposed to correct this person and that person, and everybody listen to my opinion. And like, that's not like, I mean, some people are called to that, right? Like some people, like Aaron and I have studied theology, or like I'm in a theology program, like that's, in a way, theologians have that vocation, who like are called to write on a certain area, whatever, like critique it or talk about it, or
we look at St. Catherine of Siena, who prayed for her first 20 years of life, and then the Lord said, okay, now I'm going to call you to go and like reorganize Europe, basically, and the papacy, and
it was an act of obedience on her part. She was like, okay, Lord, I obey. You know, it wasn't like she was like, well, I'm really passionate about this. Even though I'm sure she was. I mean, she definitely was.
Yeah.
But that's not where it was coming from. So
Mhm.
it's like, first of all, if we are called, so when we're called to be corrective measures in a certain sense,
Mhm.
also I think we're just so vigilant about like, where is that,
Yeah.
what's the spirit of that correction? Is it coming
Mhm.
from is it coming from pride? Or is it coming from genuine submission to the Lord's calling
Yeah.
of us in our lives? You
And
know?
I think it's getting harder sometimes to discern that.
Yeah.
And I think that
Fair.
we must go back to the examples of the saints. If
Yeah.
we want to know how to navigate tough things in the church, we must go and read the lives of the saints
Totally agree.
and read what did they do? When did they obey? How did that work out for them? What did they do? And then follow that example. Right? That's because who else are we going to follow except those who have gone before us in the church and who were I was going to say diagnosed.
Our examples,
but
right?
like lauded as having heroic virtue, right?
Yeah. And they have
right.
like they do have intense like when we're talking about the obedience that they expressed, it was not just minor like you think about Padre Pio who was not given faculties to say mass for a long time or to hear confessions because there was doubt about whether the stigmata that he had, that if it was real or if it was being faked, or if it like the other things that would happen to him, like the locutions or things like that, like whether they were fake. So then he was forbidden from saying that. And it reminds me of, this was one of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about obedience, is we're talking about like Jesus, like a lamb, he was led to the slaughter and he did not open his mouth. Like he was obedient to the Father even unto death. And so it's like that example is what the saints were following. That is who they were following in their obedience, right? Like, and they didn't just see obedience to Jesus, but they saw obedience to Jesus through the church. Who is the mother of us all and the bride of Christ, you know, which is so beautiful.
And it's so paradoxical sometimes, right? Like, so that's such a good, because like you think about Padre Pio mass, like, you know, you can watch, right? You can go on YouTube and watch him say, there are like videos of him saying mass, and you're like, this man was sort of precluded from doing this. Like, you know, it's just mind blowing, but he did. And I think it's more, his witness is more powerful for that. Like it's
for his obedience,
for his obedience, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking earlier, you know, before we recorded about Saint Teresa of Avila. She, and actually for that was an example that my uncle shared with me when I was a kid. And it was very powerful for me. Just briefly, for maybe people who don't know much about her, she also received locutions, and quite a lot of them, and very powerful ones. And her spiritual directors were like, her spiritual director was like, we don't know if this is from God. Like, you have to resist. You have to sort of
these visions and
reject
these
visions. But they were like visions of like the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and like, and she knew, I mean, Nicole was reading out to us a few things earlier. Like, she knew, she never denied that they were from the Lord. She never actually could say like, I don't think these are from God, because interiorly, she kind of knew that they were. And yet she resisted till her spiritual directors, she kept saying like, it's very tough. She was honest with them, but she kept obeying. And it was so hard. And I remember hearing that from my uncle, like when I was a kid, and just thinking like, it just made obedience make a lot of sense to me, because it had both things. Like saint is never in these contexts, is never denying the truth that they know in their hearts. They're not saying like, well, somebody said it's not true, so therefore it must not be true. They don't never do that, but they conform themselves to what is being asked of them, as long as it's not sinful in that situation, despite knowing better than the people asking them to conform.
Right.
And that's precisely their obedience, right? Like,
because God plays the long game. Like, and that's the thing, right? Is because the will of the Lord will always be accomplished in some way at some point, because he is always working everything according to his will, right? So it's, and he uses everything for good. So in all of these things, like exactly like you say, like watching Padre Pio or having Teresa of Avila and seeing this like beauty of obedience in them actually gives much more credence to the authenticity of the things that were happening, because in their humility, they were able to just give it into the hands of the Lord and trust that his will would be still accomplished in all things. And it was, you know, for powerful witness, like even more powerful than if they had never experienced that.
have another story actually, which is not obedience, but maybe exemplifies like the humility that I think the saints, because they also, we talked about humility already, but I think this is also part of why it's so powerful, because their commitment to God, and I don't, like, like I really am before God, nothing in a certain sense, and I really trust him to uphold my nothingness, like my littleness. Utterly, like I utterly trust him. So that kind of attitude of humility. So I heard this from a priest that is close to my family, who's an elderly priest who knew Mother Teresa actually very well. And he has lots of Mother Teresa stories. So he has this one story where he was with a fellow priest, and the fellow priest was sort of like doubtful about Mother Teresa because she was like becoming like a big deal. And he's like, oh gosh, it's like it goes like popular nun, like, whatever, like, thinks she's all that, like kind of thing. And this priest that I know is like kind of knew that wasn't true, but like just didn't say anything. There's like listening to this man, like kind of complain about how she was maybe like big headed or something, something like that. And I fully will put the caveat of like, I don't know all the details of the story, but something along those lines. And then what happened was Mother Teresa, they were at this conference or some kind of retreat or something, and Mother Teresa came up to them, and like this priest sort of had this opinion. And the first thing that she did was, as a sister, as a nun, like kneel before this. The very first thing was like kneel before this priest, say, Father, can I have your blessing? Like one of the very first things that she did. And he was just completely and utterly disarmed by her humility. Like he just wasn't expecting that submission from her. And yet for her, it was like not at all unusual.
Like she didn't know him, but that's just sure what she did when she met a new
exactly
priest or whatever.
Exactly. And like, so that was also very obvious, like that wasn't like, she had no idea of what he thought of her or anything like that. It was just her spirit of, sort of receptivity of the church, like the fatherhood of this priest and the blessing that it would be to receive his blessing. And so, it's just like that so much it wasn't just encountering her words or her conversation. It was just her very demeanor, that was not, you couldn't really argue with it. You couldn't, and just totally disarming. And so that's another example, I think, of like, change the conversation, right? Like just totally change the conversation. Because then the other thing is like, I'm embellishing on this story, but in that context, somebody could be thinking about Mother Teresa as a career nun, or like, their sort of thoughts about ministry and what she's doing, her mission, are totally about worldly stuff. But that kind of encounter just switches the paradigm to like, right, it's about Jesus. Like it's really, it's about all of us trying to cooperate with the grace of God to receive this gift that he's constantly of himself, that he's constantly offering to us, that's transformative.
Yeah.
Because that's really what obedience is about. I mean, I think, and maybe I'm getting like uber passionate about obedience, which is weird. So like, obedience.
That's right.
Like that is kind of what it's about. I think at the end of the day, it's about, it's not about actually the thing that you're being obedient in. It's about allowing yourself through the grace of the Holy Spirit to be opened up more and more, to be able to receive what God wants to give you, right?
Yes, 100%.
Rachel's been standing on her desk. If you're just listening and you're not, watching the video, she's been standing on her desk with her fist in the air, speaking these things over us for the last 10 minutes.
Oh gosh.
Sitting
back down now. Yeah. No, I was never sitting at my desk.
She was not. I was being facetious.
That would make it hard with the microphone and all that. But
yeah.
It's good. Well, this is good. I feel like this is a good breaking. I mean, we could talk more about this, and
we didn't even talk about being like obedient to God from the angle of like inner workings of the soul. Well, we did kind of, but like that's like a whole other. We could talk more about that at some
discernment,
point.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Sure.
Or when God is calling us to do something difficult and we have to. But
that's right.
Just getting my prop for God winks here.
Yeah. Okay. Well. So yes, Erin has a God wink. If you have thoughts, folks, listening about obedience and you want to share them with us, send us a message. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes.
Also, please, if you're listening and you like our podcast, please leave us a review, because it does help us a lot helps other folks to find us.
Yep.
All right, Erin.
Sweet.
You have a wink from God.
I do. So I've been this is the never-ending hair saga that so for anybody who's new, I have always had straight hair all of my life. I started swimming and I'm getting older, which means there's like hormone weirdness that's probably happening, so that all of a sudden I have this, and it doesn't look like it, but when it's wet, it's like curlier hair. Wavy, definitely some good waves in there. So then I was looking at what I'm supposed to do with this kind of hair, because I don't know what to do with it. So then I saw that you should use a diffuser when you're blow drying it. And then that can help retain some of the curl shape or whatever. And so I don't have a diffuser or money to buy a diffuser. Because if I don't know it's going to work, it's just going to be a waste of money. So I saw this trick on, I think Instagram or something like that, where you can buy a metal sieve. What is this called? Like a strainer. Yeah, one of those metal strainer sieve things. Anyway, so I decided I was going to do that and give it a try. So I went to the dollar store, and on the way I was like, Lord, this is ridiculous. And I feel ridiculous going to the store to buy a metal strainer to put my head in to shoot hot air at it and see if that does something. But I was also thinking, and also I have a lot of hair, and they usually only have like tiny things there. You know what I mean? Like at the dollar store, if you're getting cooking things like on the tinier side or something, I'm like, it's not. Anyway, so I walked into the dollar store and I looked, and it was right there on the wall when I first walked in. It is the biggest,
it's like 8 inches or something, eh?
that I have ever seen. It's like bigger than, like, if I put it on my head, like there's a good amount of room. It's the biggest thing I have ever seen. So anyway, so God was like, listen, don't you worry. I provide. When I provide something, I really provide it.
That's great.
So that gave me a laugh. Yeah.
I love that.
It doesn't work, by the way. So just in case anybody
was like, oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm just going to use it for craft dinner.
Nice. This whole exercise is describing, like, I just want you to know that I provide, but that's also right. Don't do this to
also get off of Instagram. Stop it. Yeah. That's right.
Oh, man. Beautiful. Well, thanks, ladies, for this chat. And thank you all for listening today. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to having you tune in next time.
Yay! God bless you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Thicket. If you like what you hear, give us a rating and hit that subscribe button. We have new episodes every Monday with more stories and honest conversations about life when the going gets rough, and the hope and humor amidst it all. We'd love for you to join our community on Instagram and Facebook at In the Thicket Podcast. While you're there, let us know how we can pray for you. God bless, and see you next week.